Hello.
Give it just a few minutes to get some more folks in here. We were having a little issue trying to share this to Facebook. Fun. But either way, no matter what happens with that, we'll have this is being recorded, so we'll be able to share it. So, so we'll share it around afterwards if we can't figure that out.
Anything I could help with, Sean?
I don't know. I had Art, who's pretty well versed in it, trying to help me out with it, but for some reason it wasn't allowed to do that.
Okay.
You have any up your sleeves?
No, I just, you know, a good amount of IT background. So I mean, I don't know what was happening when we were trying to.
It's just not giving me the option to do it. It might have been the way it was set up.
Oh, are you the host?
I am.
Okay. Are you doing it from your computer?
Yeah.
All right, and then at the bottom of, it's usually I think the bottom right, it appears on the screen. You don't have an option there to go live on Facebook?
No, unfortunately not.
All right, no worries. It is something that has to be like turned on and insist like in the preferences to begin with. So if you haven't set that up already, it might not be available right now. So,
Yeah.
no worries.
Oh, well, we'll just share it later since it's being recorded, so. All right. Just give it one extra minute here. Some people are still signing in.
Me?
Well, all right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for giving up a little bit of your Sunday for this. Hope everyone's doing all right. Sequestering yourselves at home. And thank you for Christian McNamara, who has been just doing a ton of work looking at Hamden's budget. And I think his perspective is widely respected because he has been focused on facts, on numbers, doing his best he can to kind of stay out of the political fray and just give us the facts. And I think that's why his voice has been so sought after and respected here. So what I anticipate happening is Christian is going to do his presentation, and if you could see down below that you can ask questions. Everyone should have the ability to do that in chat. You can write a question in. Also at the end, there's no reason why we can't verbally ask questions as well. But since we're going to use this as an opportunity to create a video that then could be a resource for other people that aren't here today, could be shared around. We're not going to have a back and forth during his presentation. Instead, we're going to allow Christian to go through and his whole presentation, and then we can save the questions for the end. All right, Christian, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sean, and thank you to everyone for having me. Also wanted to say a quick thank you to the folks who have helped me with the research underlying this presentation, and in particular, Sam Julier and Stocky and Judy Clark. So the presentation that I have is pretty brief, and I'm going to power through it very quickly in hopes of leaving as much time at the end as possible for discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Sean, is my screen showing up right now? Okay, there we go. Great. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the three things that I'm kind of hoping to cover in this presentation are a brief overview of our current financial condition, with the idea that it's helpful context for thinking about, as we head into the current budget season, where are we, how much room do we have, things of that nature. Sort of consistent with that idea, also a discussion of the outlook for the remainder of fiscal year 2020. Obviously, the budget conversation focuses specifically on how we'll be spending our money in the coming fiscal year, but it's first important to know how we're going to finish the current fiscal year and where that will leave us heading into fiscal year 21. And then finally, a discussion of the proposed budget that was recently released and the analysis that we've done of it. So on the first topic, the overview of current financial condition, I mean, the thing that I would say here that we've tried to stress in all of our presentations is none of what follows is about blame. I'm not much interested in the blame question at this point. I'm interested in an accurate assessment of kind of where things stand by way of providing context for thinking about where we go from here. And so the small group that I alluded to earlier and I have spent the better part of the last year doing fairly extensive research into the town's financial conditions based on audited financial statements, reports that the town has produced, et cetera. And if I had to sort of summarize the current financial condition with one takeaway, it's kind of what I have here at the top of the slide, which is Hamden has had a persistent inability to meet its full expenses. And that's kind of manifested itself in a couple of different ways, sort of depending on the year. In some years, we've seen kind of outright deficits where the amount of money that we've pushed out the door has been more coming in, and as a result, we've had a decline in the general fund balance, and we'll talk about the significance of that in a second. There have been a couple years where expenditures have exceeded revenue, and in order to sort of cover those expenditures in excess of revenues, we've relied on borrowed money. So this is a topic that folks have probably heard a lot about in some of the past budget discussions, sort of issues of capital sweeps and so forth. Basically situations in which we may have money that was borrowed for a specific project, and for whatever reason that project may not be moving forward or has been canceled, and some of that money instead being used to cover sort of expenditures that were in excess of revenue. And then failure to make full payments on long-term liabilities, and specifically the one that obviously gets talked a lot about is the underfunding of the town pension plan. And so this is, I think, what you could see happening, for instance, in the most recently completed fiscal year, where the audited financials showed the town with a small surplus at the end of the fiscal year, but that surplus was accomplished by underfunding the pension by about $6 million. And had the sort of full actuarially required contribution been made as was initially budgeted, there would have been a substantial deficit. So that's kind of what we see when we look back at kind of the history of Hamden's finances. And then one thing that specifically we've been attuned to, especially in thinking about now considering the current budget, is the fact that recently the overestimating of expected revenue has played a key role in the inability to meet full expenses. And so what that looks like is the town in its budgets producing projected revenues that end up not being fully met. And so we did sort of an analysis of the last 6 completed fiscal years and found that in each of those years, revenue was overestimated by an amount equal to about an average of $6 million per year. And so the significance of that, obviously, is when those revenues fail to materialize, you're sort of left sort of having to make up that difference somehow. And how we make up the difference is sort of some of the avenues alluded to in my earlier point. Then sort of the other thing is to think about, well, what is the significance of this inability to meet full expenses in terms of our overall financial condition? And so there are, a couple different metrics we've monitored sort of the history of over the years. And three in particular that I would highlight is just the fact that our long-term liabilities have increased and are now to the point of being being more than $1.1 billion. The fact that our general fund balance is less than $2 million. And for those who may not be familiar specifically with the concept of the general fund, it's often referred to as kind of the town's rainy day fund. The idea that this is the money that we have on hand that we can kind of use to meet unexpected expenses. And typically, our auditor has said that a healthy general fund balance would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 10% of the town's overall expenditures, much in the way that sort of an individual's rainy day fund is kind of tied to what their monthly expenses might be, sort of same concept here. And the concern is that at a level below $2 million, our general fund balance is less than 1% of our annual expenditures, when again, a healthy ratio would be more in the 6 to 10% range. And then finally, the fact that Moody's recently downgraded the town's debt to one level above junk status, which is interesting to note for a couple of different reasons. One is, this is just sort of an indication, here's a group of outside financial experts who have taken a hard look at what's going on with the town's finances, and clearly they have some concerns. So that's one reason why I think the downgrade is significant. The other reason is sort of more practical, in that as the town's debt has been downgraded, that raises potentially complications with our ability to raise additional money by issuing bonds, and sort of questions about at what cost we would be able to do that. And then furthermore, there are some potential implications for state involvement or state oversight of the town's finances when bond ratings sort of start to dip into actual junk status. So that's a very quick overview of kind of almost a year's worth of research. And if I had to sum it up in one sentence in terms of thinking about what's the significance of this as we head into the final 3 months of this fiscal year and thinking about next fiscal year, I would say that the town is already sort of very close to the financial edge and has limited capacity to deal with shocks of any kind. Which is concerning in light of what's going on in the world right now. So that's kind of the context then for the analysis that we did on the fiscal year 20 outlook presented in the mayor's proposed budget, and then ultimately the mayor's proposed budget itself. So what you see on this slide here is just kind of a snapshot from one page of the budget. And I just kind of wanted to orient people to what they will find in the budget, so that for those interested who want to take a look themselves, and I would encourage people to do so because I think it's a really interesting document. What we have here is the revenue and expenditure figures for a specific department, in this case, finance. And what you can see is, in addition to providing actual results from the most recently completed fiscal year, so fiscal year 19, which is sort of the leftmost column of figures, there's also information about the current financial year, so fiscal year 20. So we have both the original budget, the budget as revised, if there have been any revisions, year-to-date results, and then significantly for our purposes here, department projections for the fiscal year. And so again, with this idea that before we can even talk about how we're going to spend town resources next year, we need to have some understanding, the best understanding possible, of where we're going to be heading into that fiscal year. A piece of analysis that we did was to take all of these department projections on both the revenue and expense side contained in this budget and sort of sum them up department by department so that we could ultimately see what the overall picture would be. And that is what you'll see on this slide here. So again, this is sort of department by department, with the corresponding page of the proposed budget PDF, looking at what is being projected for fiscal year 20 in terms of revenue and expenses. And when you go through that analysis and sum it up, basically what this data appears to show is an almost $12 million deficit, attributable to revenue coming in about 10 million less than was originally budgeted, and expenses coming in about 2 million higher than was initially budgeted. And so again, like, one thing I want to stress about this is, like, these are numbers that we've taken directly from the budget document. This is not sort of my group's forecast or our analysis of where we think the fiscal year is going to end up. These are the numbers that we've taken from the budget document in terms of the town's projections. And per the highlighting that you see in this table, some of these projections, you know, I would have some questions about. So for instance, if you look at the first highlighting, it's the revenue for the building department. And per the budget document, as of February, year-to-date results were running at about $500,000 in revenue. But they're projecting that by the end of the fiscal year in June, they're going to get up to over 1.2 million. And so, you know, I would have some questions about whether that's actually going to happen, particularly in light of what's going on in the world. So again, that's kind of what some of this highlighting you see here reflects, is our look at what they are projecting relative to where our results are so far, and sort of wanting to ask the question, well, you know, like, how strongly do we feel about these projections? How good do we feel about these projections? And so this is kind of the analysis that we've done for what the outlook for fiscal year 20 is. And as you'll see when we get to the end of the presentation, one of the specific things that our group is certainly calling for is an updated outlook for fiscal year 20, basically saying, okay, you know, what is your latest and greatest projection for where we're going to end this fiscal year, and assuming that you're showing a deficit of the magnitude that seems to be suggested here, what is our plan for dealing with that deficit, particularly in light of the information that we looked at on the prior slide with a general fund balance of only $2 million. It's not clear sort of how we would be able to absorb this specific deficit. So that gets us to the proposed budget itself. And again, I just kind of wanted to throw up a screenshot of the actual budget document, just to orient people to how they can interpret the information contained in the budget. So there's a lot of useful information here when thinking about sort of the ultimate number that's contained in the mayor's budget, which is on the far right-hand side. How do we think about that number? Does it seem like a realistic number to include in the budget? There's sort of a couple of different ways I think that one could think about that. One is to compare it to actual results. So, you know, helpfully they've included actual results for fiscal year 19 here. I think ideally, and sort of we've requested in the past that they include multiple years. I think in the documents that were sent to the members of the Legislative Council, I think they have in fact provided multiple years, so we can sort of take a look at what the trends are. But basically the idea being, okay, what are they projecting is going to happen in fiscal year 21 relative to what's happened in the past? And so to the extent that there's any sort of significant deviation between those two numbers, it's not that the number in the mayor's budget is necessarily wrong. It's just that we would want to see kind of a very specific justification for that deviation to make sure that we feel like it's a realistic number, particularly in light of, you know, what we discussed earlier in terms of kind of a history of being overly optimistic in terms of these revenue figures in the past. The other number that I think is interesting for looking at the budget number is what the departments themselves are requesting, which is the column sort of to the left of the comments justifications column. And so there, again, it's not that a difference between the budgeted number and what the department has requested necessarily means that there's anything wrong, but it does, I think, provide an opportunity and frankly a need to ask hard questions about, do we feel comfortable with the budget number that's been introduced? Because if, you know, a department head is saying, well, I expect that this particular revenue category will generate X, and then ultimately the revenue budgeted for that revenue category is significantly higher, I think it's important to understand, you know, did the department head get something wrong, change his or her mind? You know, sort of how did we go from the person who runs the department thinking that the number is X, but ultimately building a budget around that number being much, much higher? So those are kind of some of the things that we were thinking about in performing our initial analysis of the budget, and the results of that can be seen on the next slide. So again, one of the things that we did first, because of kind of the history of revenue estimations being overly optimistic, was specifically to hone in on the revenue side and say, okay, what does the mayor's budget show relative to where we've been in the past and where department heads were indicating in terms of some of their requests? And so this is not a full list of all of the items that we identified as needing some explanation. It's just sort of a snapshot of a portion of the list to give you a sense for kind of what it looks like. We put this out as a piece of analysis, you know, probably a week or so ago. And I should mention, by the way, that we're in the process of putting together a website so that all these different pieces of analysis that we've done over time will all kind of be housed in one place, and therefore hopefully easier to access. And I should say a big thank you to Art and Mary Hunt for their help in helping us put that website together. It's well beyond my skill set, so couldn't have done it without them. But what the analysis we produced is intended to do is kind of to identify each of the specific revenue items for which justification should be provided based on deviation from either historical results or sort of what the department heads were indicating. And so again, this is just a partial list of some of them, but I think they sort of give you a feel for you know what we're thinking here, which is basically like, take building permits as an example. We talked about the building department as a whole earlier, but take building permits as an example. Year to date in February, you know, we're sort of just under $300,000. Heading into the next fiscal year, the department is requesting that revenue line be $800,000, but by the time it gets to the mayor's budget, it's up to almost $1.3 million. And again, against sort of the backdrop of the likely economic fallout of the pandemic that we're currently dealing with. So it's not to suggest that there's automatically something wrong with that number, but that number does sort of catch your eye as being significantly higher than what we've done this year already, significantly higher than what the department itself requested. And so therefore needing some justification. Why do we think it is that we can realistically expect to get $1.3 million in revenue from building permits, especially in light of what's going on? One other item that I wanted to highlight specifically that's included in the list here is at the very bottom of the list, which is the state grant COVID-19 aid. For those of you who haven't seen it, there was a really good article, I thought, in the New Haven Independent on Friday talking about this point specifically, and essentially like, what realistically can we expect from the state by way of aid related to the pandemic, and should it be reflected in the budget at all? And if so, how much, given that it's very uncertain what that amount will be? So there in particular, and especially given the size, $5.1 million in this budget, I think it's something that we really kind of need to have our eyes on and ask ourselves, like, can we build a budget that assumes that we're getting this money? Will we get that money? How much of that money will we get? What will we be able to use it for when ultimately we get it? All those sorts of questions, I think, need to be answered before you can build a budget that relies on a number that big for the budget to be balanced. So, net, and I'd say the overall picture from a revenue standpoint, and sort of what gives me pause, even without sort of pouring through the individual lines, is the fact that if you look at the overall budgeted revenue for fiscal 21, it ends up being $11 million more than was budgeted in fiscal 20, and $21 million more than our actuals from fiscal year 19. And I think there are some very serious questions to be asked and to be answered around whether that is at all realistic in light of what we're currently dealing with. I mean, I think, in the mayor's budget statement, he said that the town is likely to lose significant revenue as a result of this pandemic. And I think he was absolutely right about that. And I think municipalities across the country are preparing for that. But unfortunately, I don't think that this budget reflects that reality. And so I think that is something that we're going to have to ask a lot of hard questions about. So we didn't limit things only to the revenue side. I think a lot of our analysis was on revenue because, again, historically, that's where we've seen overly optimistic projections in the past be a particular issue. But you can sort of conduct a similar analysis on the expense side, which is to say, like, if we've got budgeted numbers for expenses that seem dramatically lower than they have been in the past, or dramatically lower than what the department heads are requesting, maybe that's a good thing because we've sort of figured out a way to be more efficient in one of those revenue expense items, and therefore sort of that reduction is good news. But I think it does require us to ask questions around whether that reduction reflects something that's actually been done to accomplish that reduction, or whether again, we're just sort of being overly optimistic and we have sort of, maybe department heads saying, hey, listen, this is going to cost us X this year, and then a number that's substantially less than X actually being put in the budget, and that number not turning out to be sort of realistic for what we could expect to ultimately spend on that item. So similar type of analysis, looking at what the budgeted numbers were relative to actual results, what the departments requested, year-to-date results. So this is actually the full list on the expense side. Again, the list on the revenue side is much longer, and so we sort of screenshotted a portion of it. This is the full list for expenses, but I'd say significantly there are some pretty large items here. One to mention right away is just debt service. And so there's this about a $7 million difference between the departmental request and what's reflected in the budget. That is a product of an assumed restructuring of the debt, which would basically take some of the amounts that were owed on our debt in the upcoming fiscal year and push them to later fiscal years through sort of restructuring of those obligations. I think there are some pretty significant questions to be asked there about if we'll be able to do that, and if so, on what terms in light of everything that's going on, and what the implications will be of that long term. So that's one item I think that we're kind of focused on the expense side. Another is a couple of items, they're kind of in the middle of the table here, both concessions and expense reductions. So this is a mechanism that we've seen in past budgets for the town, and including the budget for the current fiscal year, where basically we have our expense amount, and then that expense amount is lowered by a defined amount for either efficiency reductions or concessions or expense reductions. So it's basically a reduction in our expenses reported everywhere else, tied to some notion that we will secure concessions of some type that will ultimately reduce our overall expenses, but without, at least at the budget stage, any indication of exactly what those concessions will be, who will be making them, and what expense categories, all those types of things. So, again, I would say if you're going to include a line item in a budget which says expenses are going to be reduced by $2.5 million due to concessions, I kind of want to know quite a bit about what those concessions are expected to be before feeling like that's something that we should be building a budget around. So those are the types of items that we've highlighted on the expense side. All right. And so I'll conclude, before throwing it open to discussion, like these are the recommendations that our group has come up with in terms of steps that the Legislative Council should take in response to the situation. Number one, as I alluded to earlier, I think we absolutely need a detailed report on the current outlook for fiscal year 20, updates to those projections. What are we anticipating in terms of a deficit, and how will we deal with that deficit? The budget for next year is one thing, but we kind of need to understand how we're going to get through the next 2.5 months. Number two, I think there should be a freeze in as many expenditures as possible in light of everything that's going on in the world and our financial condition, even before sort of considering the effects of the pandemic. I think, there are any number of institutions and organizations in this area who have done this, recognizing that it's likely to be very difficult financially for the foreseeable future. Yale has frozen hiring through the end of fiscal year 21. Quinnipiac has instituted sort of across the board cuts to compensation and so forth. So the idea here is basically, let's freeze what we can right now to give ourselves as much room and as much runway to deal with what is likely to be a very challenging financial situation, not only because of the current pandemic, but just because of where we were even before. And then finally, for all of the reasons highlighted so far, I have very serious concerns about the mayor's proposed budget. I would go as far personally as saying that I do not think it's a serious document. I do not think that a proposed budget that provides for $10 million in additional revenue, when we all know that our revenues are likely to fall as a result of the pandemic, is a budget that can be adopted. And so there's going to be a need for a lot of really, really hard work to develop a realistic budget based on realistic projections of revenues and expenses, recognizing that that's going to be difficult in light of the current context. But that budget's got to take account of the current economic climate and also the long-term need for the costs of the town to be consistent with what we can actually afford. So these are the specific things that our group is calling for at this point. We have an open letter circulating that many of you have probably seen. For those of you interested in reading the open letter and potentially signing on to it, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to share it if you haven't seen it already. But I mean, I think that the bottom line is there's a lot of work to be done here with respect to the proposed budget. And my concern is that there's not a lot of time to do it. We're doing it in about as difficult financial, sort of global financial context as possible. And I'm concerned that the proposed budget has pushed a lot of that work off on the Legislative Council, who are, fundamentally part-time residents like you and me, who are going to have to do their best to respond to this proposed budget. So I'd say that's it for me, and I'm happy to answer any questions or engage in any conversation that folks would like to have.
So thank you, Christian. As always, that was eye-opening to say the least. So we also have a number of folks that might be able to help with answering questions that are in this chat right now. We have State Representatives Robin Porter, Mike D'Agostino here, might be able to answer some things in terms of expectations from the state. And we have some members of the council and prior members of the council that have been through the budget process. We have Brad, we have Kristen, we got Marjorie, we got Lauren on here, and all of them are some. Kristen, you're going to have to deal with this for the first time this year, so good luck. And but Marjorie, Lauren, Brad have been through this in the past and might have something to say. So what I'd ask is anyone who wants to ask a question, you're welcome to ask it in writing in chat, or you can just give me a reaction. Give me, if you see in the bottom of your screen, you'll see reactions. You can just give a wave, and I will call on you in the order that I see that. Christian, can you unshare your screen?
Yeah, that's what I'm currently. You'd think I'd be better at this. I've been teaching on Zoom all semester, but
we'll all be experts just as soon as we don't need this anymore.
Okay, stop share. There we go.
Fantastic. So this way I can get a little better view of who wants to ask a question here. We actually have quite a few people joined along the way here, so I got a couple of screens to look at. Oh, and Dominique is here as well. Thank you, Dominique. So she could also ask some questions, help answer some questions too. So does anyone have anything they would like to ask? Anyone here? Just put your hand up, give a wave. I see Elaine. Elaine, why don't you unmute yourself and ask a question, and then Roxana, we'll go to you next.
I'm going to assume that Christian has had some experience dealing with legislative bodies or bodies that have to deal with these hard questions. What advice would you give to our council members in addressing this, potentially contentious situation? Do you have any advice?
So I should say that I actually don't have a ton of experience advising legislative bodies on questions like that. My professional background is in sort of banking crises and sort of global financial crises, where a lot of the activity is undertaken by institutions where there isn't kind of a legislative process associated with it, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But I think, Elaine, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is going to be a difficult undertaking. And one thing that I wanted to say during the presentation, Elaine, which your question prompts me to say, is, when the proposed budget was released, part of the messaging, I think, around it was this idea that we needed to protect taxpayers from further tax increases to the maximum extent possible, given the economic pain that everyone is already experiencing as a result of the pandemic. And I think that is a very noble and wise objective. And so I guess one thing I would say is, I would encourage people to keep that objective in mind, but to recognize that the way you can actually accomplish that is by the hard work of kind of getting things under control, as opposed to relying on kind of overly optimistic assumptions about what will happen. So I don't know how helpful any of that would be to any member of the Legislative Council, but I guess that's what I've got. And just the observation that I think, as I hope, the last several months have shown, there are absolutely groups of citizens out there ready to help in any way that they can. I know my group certainly feels that way, and I know there are a lot of other people who feel likewise.
So next we're going to go to Roxana. She has a question, and then George, I believe you raised your hand. Is that right? So we'll go to George after that, and then Art Hunt has a question for Mike after that.
Hi, and thanks, Christian, and the whole team for this. This is the kind of political education, if we call it political economic education, that I think is so important for all of us to make sure that we know what we're looking at. So my question in general is, why would we use, and I'm saying we just in general, projected figures as opposed to actual figures? Like, what would be the advantage of using these projected figures when you have actual figures? And has this been, and this is for council members, has this been the practice all along, and how has it panned out?
So I'll just briefly say from my perspective, and then I think it's absolutely right that the council members weigh in as well. I mean, I think part of the challenge is that when we're crafting the budget for instance, fiscal year 21 right now, fiscal year 20 is still ongoing. So the most recent full set of actuals that we have is as of fiscal year 19. And so I think there's a sense in which what specifically happened in fiscal year 19 may no longer be reflective of reality by the time we get to fiscal year 21. And so I think that's why sort of there's this undertaking of estimating what we expect revenues and expenses to be in fiscal 21. But I think what your question highlights, and it's certainly something that underpins our analysis, is that in most instances you would expect those fiscal 21 numbers to be at least very heavily based in the actuals for fiscal year 19. And anytime there are sort of deviations, that's where you really need to ask some hard questions about, like, well, why? You know, like, why are these numbers different than the numbers that we've seen historically? But I don't know if there are any members of the council who want to weigh in on that as well.
Right. All right, so next up then is George. You have a question? Unmute yourself.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Christian for his heart and his team for such a great amount of hard work. And I just wanted to kind of summarize things from my perspective. First of all, there is no question that we're heading for a big deficit this current year. We did last year as well. And this new budget is unfortunately more of the same. The big items are the expected 5.1 in COVID money and the $7 million in savings expected from refinancing the debt once again. The other thing is, so I think that there's no question that there's a lot of money to be removed on the revenue side. All the departmental revenue is also inflated, as it has been historically. But the area that really needs work is on the spending side. And the biggest increase in spending is the pension contribution, which is a noble idea, but you know, that's up to $28 million, and that doesn't even include the $8 million for the pension bonds, which are part of the debt service that we have to go. At any rate, I think there's plenty of revenue to moderate, but all of that does no good unless we also moderate on the spending side. And by the way, the spending is really not up $11 million. The spending is really up 13.5 because the mayor conveniently took his expected concessions of 2.5 off the spending side, not off the revenue side, so or not adding to the revenue side. Either way, the spending side is terrible, and he didn't cut any jobs, he didn't cut any departmental budgets, and that's where the fight has got to be. Unfortunately, when the fight is over, and this is the last comment I'll make, I know you don't want to diatribe for me, but unfortunately, when the fight is over, and let's assume that the council has the strength to actually make some serious cuts on the spending side, the council's going to have to be prepared to override Mr. Lang's obvious veto, as he did last year, and he put the council back on its heels because all that good work on fixing things or trying to fix things didn't matter because he vetoed it and the council upheld the veto. So the most important thing is that the council members not only have to be prepared to work for changes on the revenue side and on the spending side, but they've got to be prepared to back those up with a override of the mayor's veto, which is unfortunately seems to be inevitable.
All right, very good. Christian, anything to say, or anyone else want to chime in there?
Yeah, I mean, quickly, what I would say is I think that's absolutely right. That ultimately, it's not just a revenue issue. You're looking at expenses. I'd say, sort of our focus in ensuring that some of the sort of overestimated revenues and so forth are pared back is so that we can get to a starting place where we understand sort of the true extent of the work that has to be done. Because I don't think you can sort of have the conversation around, like, you know, where do we need to make reductions, or, you know, where can we do things more efficiently, those sorts of things, until you've properly defined kind of the true size of the problem.
All right, excellent. So next up is Art, who has a question, then Rhonda after that, and Stocky, right? You have a question there after that. Very nice.
So Mike DiAgostino, you were quoted in the New Haven Independent as saying that you wish the mayor had talked to you and others about the revenue item that he put into the town budget on COVID-19 assistance. So my first question is, were you quoted accurately? And my second question is, what's the possibility that the state would provide any kind of town relief, and in what sort of a scale would we be talking?
Hi, Art, and thank you everybody for hosting this. It was a great idea. The short answer to your first question is yes, I was quoted accurately. There were a bunch of other quotes that didn't make it in, but yes, that was an accurate quote. I think probably the most important piece of advice that I don't think was in the article was that I did have a subsequent conversation with Council President McGarry and told him, and I would say this to all the council members, take as much time as possible to do the budget. I know it's been extended, I think, until June 5th or so. And the reason for that is the answer to your second question, Art, which is we just don't know. Right now, I can tell you that in this current fiscal year, the state has about a $500 million budget deficit, but that is growing and an estimate because, of course, we're not taking any tax revenue, and we won't until July. So my guess is it's bigger than that. And so the issue is how much of that federal money will be used to plug the hole in the state's budget. We're going to use some of the rainy day fund money to do that. We can't use it all because, keep in mind, we've got the next budget cycle to deal with, and there'll be a significant budget deficit there as well. So the short answer is we just don't know how much of the federal money will be used to plug the state budget deficit in order to just keep the towns whole right now in terms of ECS funding and other funding that we've got. I'd like to think, and I think, I don't know what the mayor was basing that on, but maybe he was just being aspirational in terms of some of the money would be left over to go to the towns. And I think we'd like to do that as a legislature, but it's way, way, way too early to know that. And I don't know, my guess is we probably won't even know that by the time the town is forced to do its budget. My guess is we won't have any clarity on quote unquote additional funds, if there are any, until much later in the year, if at all. Frankly, this is just me talking, just based on having gone through this before and been on the Board of Ed during the Great Recession, when there was a similar deficit on the state level. The federal money at that point in time was used to plug the hole in the state budget, just to try to keep towns level to where they were expecting. And so that's going to be our first job here, is to plug the hole in the state budget, simply to make sure the town gets the 37 point whatever million dollars in state aid that it currently is assuming that it will get, not including the 5 million. So that's kind of where we are in terms of state funds. It's really to be determined.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay. Rhonda?
Christian, what do you think about using the 2019 audit as a comparison model as opposed to the year-to-date actual? Because I did see that there was a comment here that there probably in this current fiscal year, there are budget transfers, throughout the year. And the audited financial statement has already been like a third-party review of what actually a snapshot of happened last year. So, I think, in order to help the Legislative Council review, I think to look at the audited financial from last year is a great start for them, so they can see what happened last year. I mean, we already came in last year with I think it was like a $6 million deficit. If you calculated in the deposits that were supposed to go into the pension. So that's a great start. I mean, we recommend that to most of our housing authorities, or not all of them, to look at their audits and compare those expenses and revenues with when you're determining your budget, as opposed to what's happening in year to dates. Because you can get a better snapshot on what really the actuals are, which is kind of in response to Elaine's question about why are we not just using actual information to determine the budget. It's just a recommendation, just to get some real live numbers.
That's certainly part of the analysis that we did, is to look at the budgeted numbers as compared also with the fiscal year 19 actuals. And frankly, I would go even further back than that. The one concern about having only 1 year of actuals in the budget document is that there's no ability to see trend in actuals.
Right.
And so, maybe you look at the actuals for 19 and what we're projecting for 21 are the same as the actuals for 19. But if we looked at 3 years of actuals, we'd see that number has gotten, $200,000 lower every single year after year.
Right.
But yeah, I completely agree. I think the historical results are a great starting point.
Right. I think like where we do like a 5-year comparison, and we look at the percentages there, and we take those percentages over 5 years and compare it to what the budget is. And if it's not close, then they have to come in with a very thorough and detailed explanation, especially if they're going to project higher revenue.
Yep.
You just can't throw that in there.
Yep. I think you're on mute, Sean.
You're on mute, Sean.
Is this me? Am I up? I just want to reflect on the question about what does the Legislative Council do? We've spent a fair amount of time in putting together this whole strategy off of the charts to try to figure out how best to equip folks who are part-time and put in an extraordinarily unfair situation by a budget that's dead on arrival and a year-end outlook that they count as being 12 million. So we're in dialogue with both Kristen Dolan, the head of Finance Committee, and the Finance Director, Kurt Eatman. And couple of things. One is these charts are meant to help them ask better questions. And it doesn't take, you don't have to be brilliant and you don't have to be a financial expert to ask intelligent questions around some of these charts, like why are you anticipating this revenue when you haven't had it, ever reached that number? Or how can you account for this expenditure when it's always that much more every year? So Christian has forwarded those questions to the finance committee, to the finance officer, to the mayor. But the second part B, so budget making is one thing, and that's probably going to be disastrous at best because it's going to require a lot of assistance. We certainly advise them to use the Justin Elliker model to hire outside assistance to help in both assessing the financial situation and making recommendations. But the other side of it is budget management. And because budget has been so reckless over the years and budget controls have never really been put in place, as I said to Curtis Eatman on Friday, you should really want a freeze, Curtis, because there's no way you can control this budget. If you're headed for at least a $12 million deficit, we're going to lose our rating. To make a long story short, and I've said in presentations to the Legislative Council many times, you really want a freeze because it doesn't hurt anybody immediately. So somebody doesn't get a raise, so somebody doesn't get a COLA, so somebody can't buy a police car or a new computer or what have you. When you start entering into layoffs, and frankly, I've had years and years of experience of this in local and state government in New York State in the 80s and 90s. So I've been there on many, many, many different freezes and cutback management requirements and done some consulting on this. So it's tough, but it's only step one. I mean, we're in far worse shape than all this. They need to put a freeze on just to show credibility, just to show that they're trying to address this in a realistic way. So I'll stop. But the minute you start talking about layoffs, which unfortunately will probably come because of this economic tsunami that's about to hit us, talking about layoffs shows just a real weakness in people's budget management.
All right, Robin?
Hey, thanks, Sean, and thanks, Christian, to you and your team. Phenomenal job. I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Mike was talking about to give you guys some real numbers around what OFA has estimated. And I do stress the fact that this is an estimation that was given to appropriations for what they're calling the federal COVID-19 related stimulus funding. And when I look at the town of Hamden, Hamden has actually got 3 breakouts that amount to 1.3 million, not 5.1. 82,363 of those dollars are being classified as criminal justice grants. $281,529 is being called a community block grant. And then the last piece of that is $984,725 that's being classified under education. So those 3 pockets of money is what has been estimated by OFA under this federal COVID-19 related stimulus funding for the town of Hamden. And it's about an estimate of about $1.3 million. So I just wanted to give you those numbers that's been estimated by the Office of Fiscal Analysis at the state.
Right. Sam, you had a question? Did I see a hand go up?
There we go. Not a question, but a comment, and it revolves around conversations that Christian's group has had. And one of the things I want to bring to everybody's attention is the concept of managing the risk that's starting to hit us. As I said to our group the other day, I was formerly a pilot. 2 maxims you go by is you can't use any altitude above you and you can't use any runway behind you. I think the way I approach things is to say, how bad can it get? And how quickly can and how quickly can you find yourself in a terrible situation. I would like to propose to everybody that's listening here that we have not assessed the reality of what's about to hit us fully yet. And for example, the mayor's proposed budget has a 99% property tax payment rate. When 2 weeks ago, New York Times and the Journal did, the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, less than 45% of the people made their April monthly rent payment. And so when we look at this and we've talked back and forth, we've had these discussions around how are we going to get through the next 2.5 months, and then how are we going to get through the 3 months after that? And because I'm really seeing a lack of clarity around that we could see such a precipitous drop in revenue in the town that it looks like working on a COVID floor in a hospital. And I think this is part of me is I'm dedicated. I mean, I look at things in terms of risk, and I'm not seeing an assessment of risk here that's proportionate to the situation that we're in. And it's an open-ended statement, but I think this town and everybody here needs to start saying, what happens if it's 20% worse? And just pick a number. What are we going to do? And, you know, to Robin Porter's statement right there, we have a $5.1 million COVID line item coming through somewhere out there, and she's only coming up with $1.3 million, even if it happens. So that's a risk assessment that we have to take. So that's, you know, that's an open-ended, that's a thought. And I would just like to throw that out to the group, and thank you for taking the time to hear us.
One question that was brought up in the chat that I wanted to ask, if anyone has any sense of, you know, so community development block grant money, that in the budget, is my understanding correct that that is essentially being used as revenue, but that is not something that can be used as revenue, is that right?
I can't answer that. I'm not saying that it's used as revenue. I was just looking at what's been reported in the town of Hamden and what pockets of money they're getting and what those amounts are. So when I was reporting that, that's how I was reporting it. I wasn't reporting it stating that it could be used for revenue.
No, I get that. But I think, is there a line in the budget that essentially is referring to that?
Is there a line in the budget that is referring to?
Christian, do you know if that?
I mean, there's a line in the budget that shows 5.1 million in revenue, with the label being, you know, state COVID aid. And I don't know that there's anything more by way of explanation in that budget line, but that line is definitely included in the overall revenue figures for the budget.
And does anyone know, because my understanding is that that block grant money has to go to specific purposes. Is that correct? Not to general revenue?
Generally, they usually are. You know, there's, you know, CDBG money for small cities that go to, you know, housing authorities or various other items and whatnot. I don't know if this might be something different because of the situation, but in our experience under the housing authorities, they've been applying for CDBG funds under the small cities program, which is funneled through the towns, but it goes specific to a specific program that's outlined by the feds.
That's correct. That's correct in terms of the state.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that just to piggyback on that, what Rhonda just said, it's exactly right. It's a state program that has to be spent in certain ways, just like the education money is going to have to go directly to the LEA to be spent on education, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And Lauren, you put your hand up there.
Yes, hi. So Adam Sendroff at the Keefe Center manages our CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant. Every year we get, you know, a significant amount of money that's used for specific programs. It has a lot of restrictions on it. What I've heard from talking with a lot of other finance directors from around the state is that they're going to loosen the regulations that are for what's allowable for an expense, but it cannot be used as revenue into our budget. So this is not money that should be placed, as a Connecticut state revenue in our operating budget. FEMA funding is another thing that shouldn't really be anticipated and used in our budget. We would get 75% of any expenses. And if Lang is suggesting that we're going to get $5.1 million, that's an increased expense of $7 million or so. So you couldn't reliably say that we're spending that much money. The bigger issue is a loss of revenue, and loss of revenue isn't something that's covered by FEMA at this point.
Did I see another hand go up? Brad, did you want to, you mentioned about the agenda tomorrow and putting off the deadline for taxes. Did you want to?
Yeah, no, I not much to say there. I just noticed this and people were chatting about taxes and whether or not people's property taxes are actually going to come in, since everybody's being impacted by this in a financial matter as well. There is an item on tomorrow's agenda that would delay the deadline that's normally July 1. You can pay your taxes October 1 instead. So I don't know what kind of implication that's going to have. Hopefully it's going to help people, be able to pay the full amount without having to face any penalties. But no doubt people are sort of in tough financial situations and we don't really know what kind of impact that's going to have. And I think that point's already been made, right? I mean, we do our budget almost entirely on projections, and, a lot of this year is, we know that the 5 million is almost undoubtedly not happening, right? Like, clearly undoubtedly not happening, but then there's the other question about, like, I don't remember if it's like 98 or 99% of taxes that we normally expect to come in. Is that a realistic number this year? We don't know, and we're not going to know until way after we're done with our budget.
Okay, excellent. Lauren, you said you have a question?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Brad. I'm wondering if there is a plan for paying people if we have a huge loss of revenue come July 1st. That's usually the time of the budget where everything's really easy because there's a huge pot of money.
Right.
And, what do you do if a lot of people can't pay their taxes for July 1st? How do we pay employees?
As far as I'm concerned, this is pretty unprecedented, and I'm not sure what the answer is there. There's no doubt that, like, I'm sure there's some case studies. You could probably look back to the financial crash that happened a little over 10 years ago. You could probably look back to that and have sort of an idea of what happens on a much, much smaller scale. To my knowledge, that has not been done. That's not something the administration or the finance department has done. That work has not been done. It's something that's been brought up and discussed, but there's no real work that's been done there. So I don't know.
All right, so we're coming up on 70 minutes. Does anyone have any final questions? Sarah, you have a question, is that right? I could read what she wrote here. She said, can someone talk about the options the Legislative Council has for working with the Board of Ed budget projections? Does a council member want to answer that?
I'm sorry, that question is regarding, I'm just pulling up the chat now, projections in terms of revenue, or, because I don't know if she's talking about what changes have taken place in the Board of Education budget, given, the fact that we're schooling from home at this point, or is she talking about the projections for next year and the implications there, or is she talking about ECS revenue projections? There's a lot of projections there. I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. No doubt, there's a lot of things we're not sure of. Oh, projections for 21 re-expenses. I'm not sure if I understand what that's asking. I'm sorry. There's a lot of uncertainty, and in terms of the changes that have taken place in the last few months due to the transition to work from home, that's information that I've asked for, but I haven't been given yet.
All right, very good. Let's see. Oh, okay, hold on. She's still asking. Katie says, do we know how many homeowners pay their taxes directly versus use their mortgage lender to pay taxes? Because I know that mortgage companies will still pay the taxes as long as they are not foreclosing.
I don't know if anybody else knows. I don't know. I can ask and find out.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some way that we can find out, what percentage of payments come from mortgage lenders.
All right, so very good. Any final questions? I want to respect everyone's time here. George, you have a quick question? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you.
There you go.
Actually, I had a small item to bring up about the school budget. The new budget is another game. But when it comes to the current budget, the schools will be getting some rebated money for things like bus service not rendered, and this the state mandated that we pay the drivers and their insurance, but it doesn't. The operating costs for the buses and so forth should be coming back to the town, as well as some non-personnel, non-medical costs for some of the special ed facilities that we use. So there should be, I would hope, a couple of $1 million coming back for the current year. What happens to that, we don't know. I'm sure if allowed to, the board would be happy to consume that, especially if their budget gets cut. But that's real money.
All right, thanks, George. All right, so let's wrap this up. And Christian, again, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, kind of a last-minute basis there. And any final thoughts before we call it a day?
No, just my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and happy to talk with anyone who wants to about this stuff, because it's really important, and happy to assist in any way I can.
Fantastic. So we'll figure out how to share this video after we're done here, and we'll share it around to various pages to continue the conversation online. So thank you for everyone for taking the time out for this really important discussion. Bye.
Say bye.
All right, thanks again, Christian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christian.